Good afternoon, everybody. Just to be sure, and so that people can escape if they are not in the right room, welcome to featured roundtable, The Future of Populism. So if this is not the room where you would like to be, feel free, we won't be offended. If you are in the right room, we certainly are. It's my pleasure to welcome you. My name is Petra Guasti. I'm associate professor here at the Charles University. I will be co-chairing this with my colleague, Professor Mattia Zulianello. He will take the word very soon. Populism has become one of the buzzwords of our time. The populist leaders have gained popularity in many countries around the world. The scholars have largely dispelled many myths about populism, and Mattia will go into it very soon. What we are trying to do today is we have invited an amazing panel of scholars who have dedicated years of their time. They're, of course, all young, but already very, very accomplished. And I will introduce them briefly. So I would like to first introduce Professor Sarah de Lange. Sarah de Lange is a professor of political pluralism at the Department of Political Science at the University of Amsterdam. Sarah has been Dr. J.M. Den Uyl. I'm butchering it, but come on, everybody butchers the Czech names too. Jean Monnet Fellow at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute and visiting scholar at the Goethe University in Frankfurt. Her main research interests concern parties, party families, and party systems. Her work is broad in geographical scope and examines party politics in various East and West European countries. She's currently working on a project, Gem Diamond, about the far right and illiberalism. The next is Daphne Halikiopoulou, over there. Daphne is the chair of comparative politics at the University of York. She was previously a professor of comparative politics at the University of Reading. She gained her PhD from LSE and worked as a fellow in comparative politics there. Daphne is interested in party politics and voting behavior, focusing on far-right populism and nationalism in Europe. She is the author of Understanding Right-Wing Populism and What to Do About It, together with Tim Vlandas, The Golden Dawn's Nationalist Solution, Explaining the Rise of Far-Right in Greece, with Sofia Vasiliopoulou, and numerous articles on European far-right parties. Our third guest is Kai Arzheimer. Kai is a professor of German politics and political sociology at the University of Mainz in Germany. Between 2017 and 18, Kai was Hannah Arendt's visiting chair in German and European studies at the University of Toronto. Previously, he was a lecturer in German and West European politics at the University of Essex. His research interests include voting from national and comparative perspective, with a specific interest in voters of far-wing extremist parties in Western Europe. He's one of the greatest scholars of alternative for Germany. I love everything he writes, and that's the case for all four of the panelists, and of course Mattia's work. Kai has published widely on political behavior and electoral politics. Last but not least, Giorgos Katsambekis is a researcher in comparative politics at the National Center for Social Research in Greece and a visiting fellow in European and international politics at the Loughborough University. In 2018, he founded and until 2022 convened the Populism Research Group, and between 2019 and 22, he served as a co-convener of the Populism Specialist Group at the British Political Studies Association. He's also co-editor of Volume's Research Handbook on Populism, published with Edgar Elgar. So this is for our panelists, and I give the word to Mattia, who will take us from here. Thank you.
So greetings. My name is Mattia Zulianello, and I'm assistant professor in political science at the University of Trieste in Italy. So I'm really honored to be here. Actually, there is an amazing lineup in this panel, and also I can see, I mean, world level scholars in the audience. Sorry, yeah. So it's a kind of, you know, oh, really? Can you hear me now? Okay. So I would like to thank the amazing lineup of scholars that is attending the panel, and yeah, maybe. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm sorry. So I want to express my gratitude to the ECPR, to the Charles University, to all the panelists, and also to Petra, because it's really an honor to be here. My research primarily focuses on populist parties and party systems in Europe, and I define myself as a comparativist, so that's what I do. I especially focus on Europe. I try to speak about some misconceptions now, very briefly, about populism. I mean, for some scholars of populism that are attending the conference, they are pretty obvious, and I'm sorry if I will be somehow obvious, but for others, maybe they're useful because we need to remark some misconception on populism. You know, populism is one of the most used and abused terms in political science in nowadays, and there are still many misconceptions about the term. So one myth about populism is about the fact that populism is associated with specific political positions, right? So when we think about populism, we think that populists do specific things, like in economic terms, in cultural terms, in terms of public spending, and whatever. But in fact, populism is only a moral thing, right? It points to a moral division between the pure people and the corrupt elite, and it has very little about the programmatic features of a given political party, right? So if you think about food, populism usually it's not the main dish, right? It's the condiment that you can add to a specific sort of food, but mainly the biggest part of the political program of a political party is another kind of ideology, the so-called thick ideologies. In fact, many journalists and the media also think that populists tend to be Eurosceptic. There is a lot of work. I mean, there are many scholars here that have worked on the topic. Many people in the media and the public debate still think that populists tend to be anti-immigration, but you know, there are many variations on the topic. And this is the easiest myth about populism. Another one is that populism is either left or right. We tend to think about populism in very, you know, dichotomous categories. Populists tend to be on the left, on the right. We know that the conception of the people for right-wing populists is exclusionary, for instance. They define the people in terms of nationalism, exclusionary form of nationalism, that is also called nativism, or following neoliberalism. Then you have left-wing populism that tend to embrace egalitarian ideologies, like, you know, all the people. We can we embrace the conception of the people to include the marginalized groups and so forth. But then scholars tend to forget there are many other types of populists in the world, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. There are valence populists, for instance, that are also called centrist populists, whatever, or technocratic populists. They don't primarily compete on their left and right dimension. Of course, you can put a political party on the left-right dimension, but maybe it's not the right dimension. I mean, they primarily focus on non-positional issues like anti-corruption, transparency, democratic reform. So these are valence populists. In the Czech Republic or Czechia, you have a good case. You have Anno 2011, which is an instance of valence populist. In Italy, we have the Five-Star Movement, which is the only case of valence populist in Western Europe, for very well-known reasons, right? The levels of corruption that we have in Italy, the perceived levels. And valence populists tend to prosper when there are contexts, in contexts where corruption levels are very high. And then lately, I mean, in recent time, there is a comeback of agrarian populism. Agrarian populism was one of the earliest forms of populism in the US and in Russia. But now we are experiencing a return of agrarian populism in the Netherlands. So we have at least 4 types of populist parties in Europe today that can be classified according to the interaction between populism and other types of ideology. And then the final misconception is the probably the direst to the hardest to fight, because populists are seen as a challenger parties, you know, like populists are outsiders. Every time there is a populist party that goes to the government, there is everyone saying, oh, wow, let's see what happens when a populist go into the government. You know, in Italy, we have a coalition government that is made by the leading party is a populist radical right party, Fratelli d'Italia. Then the biggest coalition partner of the government is another populist radical right party, which incidentally is also the oldest parliamentary party that we have in Italy. The remarkable and interesting part of that is also that the League is the oldest parliamentary party, but is still perceived as a party that is running against the establishment by many people. For example, I conducted interviews with activists and sympathizers of the League over the last few years, and they tell me, like, of course the League is against the establishment, right? But because the establishment is always constructed in a moral way, it has nothing to do with the specific and real position of a political party. Think about Chavez in Venezuela. Think about Viktor Orban, how they can manage to fight the establishment even though they control almost everything in the country. So we have to go beyond this traditional and exhaustive idea of populist parties and being on the fringes. And if you think about that, I mean, deeper, you can understand that the integration of populist parties is a challenge to almost everything that we thought about the functioning of party systems until, I mean, you know, the 80s or the 90s. Because in the past, the integration of political parties was supposed to be a process that was accompanied by ideological moderation, right? A party to integrate has to moderate. But in fact, you have the integration of many populist parties that change very little after the integration in the coalition game or in government. And it's something that has to be accounted. It's a new evolution that changes the whole functioning of a party system. So we have to take in consideration also this. A final point that is very important, we don't have to overestimate the importance of populism, right? Because almost every one of us is writing about populism, but in fact, we are writing about the right, I mean, the populist radical right, or the other varieties of populism. In fact, populism is really the least important ideological element for populist parties. And if you take a look at the literature, in most of the cases, the scholars, including myself, we are not writing about populism. We are writing about a specific variety of the phenomenon. So it's really important because we need to remember that the focus should be placed on other thick ideological elements. It is also important because that should invite us to reflect on the importance of de-emphasizing the importance of populism and perhaps giving more attention to other ideological elements. Thank you for your attention.
So, okay, this is how we will continue. So, thank you, Mattia, for introducing where we are and where we would like to start this roundtable. Just for the technical things, we have asked 3 questions, which I will now reiterate and tell you the order of our speakers. So the first question was, who's your favorite author on populism and why is Margaret Canovan? Well, it's not the real question, but kind of the joke question. So joke's done. The first question was, from the perspective of your own research, what do you believe is the most persistent myth about populism and how is it to be dispelled? Second, in regards to populism, and we have now experienced the whole life cycle of populism, from electoral breakthrough to populism in office to populism losing power. What are, in your opinion, the most important and lasting changes populism in power causes to the democratic politics and policies? And they can pick one or more. And finally, what, in your opinion, are the yet underexplored issues in the area, in the study of populism? What would your research if you got €50 million grant without any strings attached? So these are the questions we have posed to our panelists, and we will proceed in the same order as they have been introduced. We will start with Sarah, continue with Daphne, go to Kai, And finally, and last not least, to Giorgos, we will then give the panelists the possibility to react to each other and go to the questions. And I would also like to acknowledge our online audience, and you have also the possibility to ask the questions online, and I will try to alternate to give the same opportunity to the people in the room and also outside. So now the floor is Sarah's. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having us here today and for the kind introduction. It's wonderful to see that there are so many scholars interested in populism, even if their own research might be in our other areas. And I think you're absolutely right to acknowledge that all scholars of populism are somehow standing on the shoulders of Margaret Canavan, because if she hadn't identified populism as a really substantive idea about the relationship between the people and their representatives and democracy, I don't think we would have ever thought of the current parties that are competing and being successful as populist parties. But I also think we wouldn't have adopted necessarily that framework if it weren't for Paul Taggart, who I think is somewhere in the audience, who was one of the first in the 1990s to really use this term as a central element for understanding, especially parties in Europe emerging that combined populism with other ideologies, but put the focus on the populism in their ideology, in their discourse, and how we could understand how that really was a different form of politics than we used to know with other kinds of political ideologies in the past. Interestingly, he told me yesterday that while we are discussing the future of populism, he is actually researching the end of populism. So we're clearly behind on the trends here, and we need to catch up again. My own field, or my own topic of study that brought me to populism 15 years ago is populist parties and their participation in government, the conditions under which they come into government and what they do once they assume government, especially in the Western European context in coalition governments. And I think when I started out 15 years ago, there were actually a lot of preconceptions of what populist government would look like. But I think most of the preconceptions that existed, such as that populism couldn't be combined with taking up responsibility in government, or that taking populist parties into government might be an effective means of mainstreaming them, of taming them, have already been dispelled more than 10 years ago. And there's some scholars who've done excellent work on this in the audience. I think Reinhard Heinisch and Duncan MacDonald have shown that it's very much possible to have one foot in and one foot out, as Daniela Albertacci and Duncan MacDonald have termed it. So being in government, refocusing your populist opposition to other types of elites than the established parties that you're governing with, whether that's the left-wing media, the European elites, the judiciary, it's very well possible to remain populist in office. And I think that other research on mainstreaming that has shown that even if populist parties might, under some condition, mainstream when in office, they quickly radicalize again once they have incumbent status. I mean, the Austrian case is very illustrative in that respect. You know, the FPÖ in some of its periods in government has become more moderate in the sense that it toned down its populist discourse. But, you know, as soon as they stepped out, they amped up the populist rhetoric again to gain electoral support. I think the most important myth, so to speak, we're still struggling with is one that Mattia already mentioned, and that is that populism is actually not all that important. And that's maybe a bit counterintuitive to say in a panel about populism. But if we look at understanding voting behavior for parties that are populist, if we look at strategic behavior, if we look at issue emphasis in parliamentary debates or the kind of decisions that populist parties make when they enter coalition government, it always becomes apparent that the host ideology is more important than the populism itself. That it is the nativism, that it is the socialism, that it is the agrarianism, if we look at new populist parties such as the BBB in the Netherlands, that is really driving these parties, and that the populism is an extra element that can be useful in certain contexts and can certainly help us understand some facets of behavior of parties and voters, but certainly not everything. And I think one of the things we've been struggling with in that respect is that we rarely see that different kinds of populist parties are roughly equally successful at the same time within the same political context, so that we can really tease apart analytically what the host ideology is doing and what the populism is doing. You know, we see many countries where it's either the populist radical right or the social populist left that is successful at a particular point in time, but no, not both at the same time. So I think what we really need to advance to and pickle that is much more focused comparisons in most similar or most different systems designs. So what we've been seeing in the field is an explosion of quantitative studies, because we can say a lot now that we have databases that can measure populism. We can say a lot because we have databases such as FeedDem that can measure the quality of liberal democracy, so that we can analyze the relationship between the two. And we see a lot of case studies of scholars that have really great in-depth knowledge of a particular party in a particular country. But I think to really advance theoretically at this point, we need these focused comparisons between different parties in different countries, where we can pick apart the populist elements of our analysis and the host ideologies element to have better comparison, left-wing populist, right-wing populist, etc. And I think we really also need that to see what the effect of populism on democracy is. There has been a lot of research, especially initiated by Cristobal Rovira Kaltwasser, that compares Latin America with Central and Eastern Europe. And that comparison is essential because we see the predominance of right-wing populism in one region of the world and of another type of populism in the other. And it's only by comparing the two, but also making very reasoned decisions about, you know, what kinds of political systems are comparable, because they're so important in understanding this impact of these parties, that we can really see what the populism is doing here and what is actually more authoritarianism and nativism. And I think in that respect, we also really need to, as a field, really engage in dialogue with the people that are doing the democratic backsliding research, because they pay much more attention to institutional factors and structures, whereas we are much more actor oriented. And I think the two really need to come together in some ways. Personally, I'm actually less interested in what these parties do in government, because I think we already know quite a bit. There's so much study in Hungary, etc. I'm much more interested in what it actually is that these parties do in opposition. Not only how they use parliamentary instruments and other kinds of instruments that are at the disposal of populist parties, and how they then more subtly influence politics, and influence perhaps, for example, the way that mainstream parties think about democracy, what it is, and how important majoritarianism is in democracy, and how that then feeds through to how citizens conceive of democracy, etc., in very, very subtle ways, not in thinking in terms of big models of democracy, but also in the sort of soft power strategies that they use, even in opposition, to influence civil society, journalists, scholars, etc. I think we underestimate the impact of these parties when they're in government, because we're so focused on what power can do for them in how they impact our democracies and our societies.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sarah. Just a small point on what the populists do in opposition. Again, Czech Republic is like, welcome to the playground. We now had the opportunity of having a second year of experience how ANO, which immediately after its electoral breakthrough joined government, it spent 8 years there. Now it's in opposition. And the way populism works with parliamentary procedures, which are there to protect opposition, and how they are challenging the rules of the procedure and putting pressure on the majority, on the government, whether to change the rules of the procedure to kind of, make it more difficult to do obstructions. So here, basically every vote now takes days. So the members of parliament are having sleeping bags and taking turns, and they're there for 3 days. And so that's where we are here. But thank you very much for raising these important points. And I give the word to Daphne.
Thank you, Petra. Can you hear me? I know the acoustics are not amazing here, so I'm just going to try and speak as loud as possible, but do wave if you can't hear me. So thank you so much to Mattia and Petra for inviting me on this really interesting panel. I think that the series that you have and the attempt to dismantle some myths around populism is really important. I'm also really happy to see such a big audience and look forward to engaging with your questions. It's also a bit sad because it does show that populism is still a very interesting and important topic that we're all interested. So I'm kind of torn about that. But anyway, I have about 6 minutes and we were tasked each to answer 3 questions. So I'm just going to try and do it as concisely as possible, starting with the first question, which is an important myth surrounding populism. And I do agree with everything that Sarah said. So I'm just going to take it a bit differently, so not to repeat myself. And I want to focus a bit on the demand side. So I want to focus a bit on the myth, if you like, of the populist voter, or the right wing or far right populist voter. So I guess is this better? Is this better? Yes. So one thing, I come from the study of the far right. This is how I entered this debate. And a lot of the discussion essentially about why populism is on the rise is sort of this idea that we are now experiencing a new emerging transnational cleavage where societies are not anymore divided by haves and have-nots, but rather by people who support and oppose multiculturalism. Therefore, the right-wing populist voter is really a person who is, and I like to label my voter profiles, this is a culturalist. It's a person who is very concerned about the erosion of national identity in the country and has significant cultural concerns over immigration. And while I think that this tells half the picture, I think this doesn't tell us everything. And I think we need to move on and also understand other types of voters that also support particularly far-right populism. So in my own work, for example, I have looked at also voters we call the materialists. These are voters who are concerned primarily with the economy or the economic concerns over immigration. Also the welfareists, those who are concerned that they're not getting welfare provision and that they are fighting immigrants or competing with immigrants for access to welfare, jobs, public services, etc. The decliners, which are those who are experiencing social mobility. So some work I'm focusing on now actually shows that there is a share of the population that falls from very high classes to lower classes. And these people are extremely likely to vote for the far right. And finally, some work I've done with my colleague Sofia Vassilopoulou, who I think may be here, the distrustful voter, if you like, or those voters who distrust political institutions. Now, the interesting bit about that is not only that what we're really seeing is that the composition of the far-right voter pool consists of very different people with very different concerns that include culturalists, but not only, but also that culturalists constitute a very small group of the far-right voter pool numerically. So while these people are extremely likely to vote for far-right parties. There are actually very few of them. So in order to understand the success of these parties at a broad scale, we're seeing we already talked, Petra, Mattia, Sarah mentioned some of these parties doing well. Some of these parties are in government and are getting 30, 40%. You can't get that with a few culturalists alone. You need to forge a coalition of voters. And the way these parties are doing that is by basically attempting, I would say, particular nationalist, and here I agree with Sarah, it's about the host ideology, right? Particular nationalist narratives that tap into the various different types of insecurities. This makes them very hard to fight, because they're no longer, these are not any longer niche parties on the margins of the party system that essentially have stigma, the stigma of fascism or the stigma of extremism. These are now more mainstream parties that are forging large coalitions, and people think, sure, I can vote for this party because this party is legitimate. So I think this is really something that we need to focus a bit more. The broad coalitions, the disaffected voters, economically, culturally, politically, that support these parties across different countries. Now, takes me to the second question. A lot of you might raise your hand and say, but why is this a problem? If they've mainstreamized, then maybe actually that's fine, right? Maybe it's not so bad. Maybe they're not having an impact at all on democracy. But again, I would say this is really exactly the problem. And I would highlight that the effect, the implications of the rise of populism, and again, I want to emphasize I'm talking more about far-right populism, which is my area, are threefold. So on the one hand, we have seen that these parties are getting increasingly more votes. So they are popular. You're all here to hear about them, right? They are popular. But again, some of them decline. So, in Greece, you can ask me, one election before, we could say, oh no, there were no right-wing populists in government. Now there are in parliament. Now there are 3. So voting for these parties fluctuates. However, what we are definitely seeing in this wave that is perhaps different is that more and more of them are now in government. And that does mean either in coalition, but also alone. Look at countries in Central Eastern Europe, look at Italy, look at Scandinavia. So these parties are now actually able to implement policies and to be very much involved in the political, in the decision-making process. And third, and even more worrying, in my view, is that these parties are now also driving party competition. So what we're saying is that the cordon sanitaire is gone. And the reason it's gone is precisely because these parties are looking really legitimate, and they're utilizing nationalism in a way that makes them look sort of as they're defending cultural identity in a very mainstream kind of way. That now means that other parties believe that they can only defeat the far right by imitating the far right or far right populism. So those even parties from the center left are saying, well, maybe if we adopt stricter immigration policies, then we will beat these parties, right? So what we're actually witnessing is a move towards the right across the party system. And as an implication of that, another worrying phenomenon is that basically, and I will agree with Sarah here. I mean, are we actually talking about populism even, or are we talking about a general trend towards authoritarianism? There's a move generally towards the right. These parties are now in government and they can implement policies that erode democratic rights. They're also making changes in places like the judiciary. So when they're gone, the changes are more permanent and they remain. So it's very concerning, I think, where this is going to go. And so finally, the third question, if I had 50 million, is it pounds or euros? Anyway, if I had 50 million pounds, I don't know where I would be, perhaps not here. But but I think it's a great question, because it is indeed the case, I think, that populism as an umbrella, right? I guess a lot of us here, we come from the study of the far right, the far left, anti-establishment. We all put an umbrella of populism, and somehow, we're all studying this phenomenon, which is in many ways a flogged horse, right? Everybody. So it's more difficult to find something new. It's more difficult to identify future avenues for future research. I would like to highlight quickly 2. The first Sarah mentioned, and I will agree, comparisons beyond Europe are fundamental. in the way that you said, Sarah, that obviously we have perhaps the right-wing populism in one region and far-left populism, say, in another, but also differences within the specific types of populism. So we had a fantastic discussion indeed with Cristobal, Rovira Kaltwasser and colleagues about right-wing populism in Latin America and how that compares. And I was really interested to hear how they utilize nationalism in a very, very different way. So I think comparisons also, of course, the case of India, so it's Australia, New Zealand. I think looking at this phenomenon as a worldwide issue is very important. But a second avenue that could also be highlighted is climate, which I also think is very important. One thing that we are witnessing, I think, across Europe at least, is an emerging or a re-emerging, if you like, center-periphery divide along the lines of climate change policies and support in opposition to them. And we do see that many right-wing populist parties are actually taking the stance of against climate change measures, and they are tapping into certain types of voters that may also be overlapping between the right and the left. So I think this emerging center-periphery divide in climate is a really interesting way to go. So I will just very quickly end with one sentence, I think, because this is a panel on the future of populism. So I just want to say that I guess having heard it all, what we discussed, I'm not sure if there is an end to populism simply because populism is malleable, simply because whatever it is that we don't like, it's just this buzzword. So as politics changes, as perhaps we move on to effective polarization or climate change policies or anti-establishment, populism evolves with it. So I do worry that populism as a term is really here to stay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daphne. And I think, after COVID, you can definitely run a 50 million project from Caribbean. I think everybody will be happy to come for an annual meeting. So thank you so much. And now, without hesitation, I give the word to Kai.
Yeah. So can you hear me? Yes, you can hear me. This is becoming something of a ritual here. Also from my end, many thanks for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure and honor to be on this round table. My background is quite similar to that of Sarah and of Daphne, so it's also getting a bit repetitive, and I try to be brief and concise in my answers to these three questions. I came to the field many decades ago when it was still the study of the extreme right and populism was not that important. I think both theoretically, but also in terms of the actual practices of the parties and actors, at least in the countries that I was studying. So the extreme right was quite elitist in a way and shied away from appearing too populist. That certainly colors my views, which might be biased. And so I'm trying to push back against three rather specific persistent myths that I have encountered in my research, namely that populism is something new, that it is relatively harmless, and that it is somehow exciting and relevant. As regards the first point, populism became a thing in Western Europe in the 1970s and 1980s at the latest. And I see some people in this room have been around at the time and have been studying populism for much longer time than me. So I'm slightly embarrassed to point that out, but it's really something that has been part and parcel of European politics for a long time. And if we look at Latin America, probably the 1940s and 1950s could be identified as a golden age of populism. And if we look at North America, Canada, and the US, agrarian populism in the late 19th century, we could say it's been around for a very long time. So unlike our devices, you could perhaps say the hardware changes, but the software has been very much the same for more than a century. And so the myth of populism as something new is, I think, exactly a myth. My second point is not even a myth, but rather a sort of misunderstanding, I think. Journalists keep asking people like Sarah and me whether some far-right party or far-right populist is still a populist, or is he already a radical or even a more dangerous extremist? So the one thing is apparently fine, the other thing is seen as highly problematic or beyond the pale. And like most people in this room, I would say that this is a somewhat nonsensical question, because we understand populist and populism not as a sort of lesser shade of extremism or being an extremist on some sort of scale that runs from accepting democracy to rejecting democracy. For us, it's rather a separate category. And we keep explaining that to our students, to journalists, sometimes even to politicians. But in the context of far-right politics in Europe, at least, that is a sort of zombie question that always comes back and is apparently unkillable. And that brings me to my third myth, and this is quite similar to what Sarah and Daphne have already said. That is the idea that populism is the central problem that is undermining liberal democracy. I do not agree. That is because, like many here, I have a notion, a conception of populism as a sort of thin ideology, something that is more like a frame that needs to be filled with a host ideology. And I think this core idea of populism, this idea of questioning authority, of returning power to the people, of pushing back against the rule of the elites, that is something that is not a problem in itself. It is something which has a deeply democratic impetus and is, in my view, a valid and legitimate political strategy to use. The real problem, in my view, or the real issue occurs not with populism itself, but rather with the host ideologies. And in the context of my own research, that is in most cases a system of far-right ideas. And it's really those far-right ideas, in my view, that threaten and undermine liberal democracy or even democracy as such. These ideas are dangerous, whether they are packaged with populism or not. So populism is more of a means here. That was my answer to the first question. I'll be more brief with the second question. What are, in your opinion, the most important lasting changes that populism in power has caused? First off, this is not really my field. So I'm referring to some rather old and boring cases that we're all reasonably familiar with, and that would be, in my view, the rise of the Berlusconi governments in Italy in the 1990s, Orbanism in Hungary, the Trump administration in the United States, and the events leading to Brexit and then to the installation of the Johnson government in the United Kingdom. And I'm sure there are more interesting cases and probably cases people have better ideas about than what I can do here. What I can do here is to come up with a list of changes drawn from these examples that is rather depressing, but not in any way particularly original. First on my list would probably be effective polarization. The fact that people start hating the outgroup, that politics becomes polarized in a sense that it is pictured and seen by citizens as a conflict between different tribes. And I think this is something that is fueled by populists, both in power, but also probably in opposition. But again, I might argue that this is not really new in European politics. If you look back at the political conflicts in the 1920s, 1930s, or even in the 1950s and 1960s, when the traditional cleavages of church versus state or capital versus labor were still really important, highly politicized. I think we don't have many surveys going back that far, but I think you had quite similar levels of effective polarization. So I'm not really sure if this is even something that is specific to populist mobilization over the last 2 or 3 decades in European politics. The second thing that I would associate with populists in power is, I think, more specific, and these are the insistent attacks on independent liberal media and the judiciary. That is, I think, a real problem that came about with populism in Europe, at least, and something where more lasting damage has been created in these countries I was thinking of. And this goes hand in hand with a focus of political energies on symbolic, largely made-up issues and conflicts, which drains political will, political power, and political energy from real issues that needs to be solved, like, for instance, climate change, just to mention it here on this wonderful sunny day. You could probably also add corruption to this list. And of course, this is nothing that is specific to populists in government, but it seems to be a very strong correlation that populist powers in government are very good at filling their own pockets. And at least in the Hungarian case, these damages seem to be permanent and quite encompassing. I'm more optimistic about the other cases, though it seems worth pointing out that populism has done some other kind of damage, which is probably underestimated, and that is damage to the party system. If I was a right-wing voter in any of those countries, which party would I turn to? If you live in the US, or even if you live in the UK and you are conservative without being a mad person, what party do you vote for? There's not much choice left. So there's no reasonable alternative for center-right voters. And I think that creates long-term problems, both politically, but also a normative problem, because there's a lack of representation at the moment, I think. The third question, that was the fun question. We get 15 million, I don't know what, Czech krona, euros, pounds, dollars, whatever. I didn't notice that Sarah wanted to spend her 50 million, so I'm at 100 million now, but I don't need 100 million. In a past project, the two of us, together with some very eminent colleagues, have looked into the impact of truly local factors. Sarah told me yesterday that she would never do this project again because it was so horrible to work with me and all these people and deal with these terrible data and stuff like that. What we found in this project were quite moderate effects. We expected that local context should have profound impacts on populist attitudes, particularly on far-right populist attitudes, but the effects that we found were interesting, but not really getting us any big prizes anytime soon. I think that might have something to do with the fact that we collected data on basically public opinion at a very fine scale and also local living conditions, but we did not collect data on local media, on local politicians, on local mobilization events. And for 10 million, I think we could do that if she would ever agree. And probably we could also cover 2 or 3 additional countries. So that is my first 10 million whatever spent. The second chunk of the money. There is very interesting research going on around the idea of pre-bunking claims. So in misinformation research, people have made interventions where they trained ordinary citizens to recognize fraudulent claims about vaccines and political events and whatnot. And this is not exactly the same level as populism, because this is about things that could be shown to be true or false. But I would be interested to see if this could be transposed to the field of populism. So if it was possible to construct interventions that would make people less prone to be affected by populist messages. I understand that one thing is ideology and one thing is more or less reality. So it's probably much more complicated. But I think if I would spend another 5 million on that kind of research, that would be enough to run at least some experiments in 4 or 5 countries that would answer this question, if it is doable in principle. And that leaves 35 million or perhaps 85 million, depending if Sarah makes up her mind about her chunk of the money. And I would invest that money in education and prevention programs, because I think we're studying every nook and cranny of populist thought. We are knowing quite a lot about this field already. And I think it would be wise from a societal point of view to redirect at least some of our energies and the funding we get into more applied research that would help us to educate teachers, journalists, and the general public. I think that money would do a lot of good.
Thank you so much. And I think we can agree that Kai will be the bank and you'll just let him disperse the money with the condition that there will be some annual meetings in lovely places. So thank you. Thank you so much. I think this question also says, you know, I think a lot of research and a lot of research grants are pushing people to do things that are relatively secure. And I mean, with this question, it was like, we also need to take risks. We need to do projects which maybe won't work out. And I think that was really interesting that you went there. So thank you so much. And I now give, without hesitation, Giorgos, who has been patiently listening, the floor.
Thank you so much, Petra. Hope you're listening. Should I use that one? Yeah. Should be good. Thank you very much. It's great to be here among such excellent colleagues and with so many good people in the audience. I was going to start with one specific myth in mind to answer the first question, but as I was listening to everyone, I thought of a small one, a bonus myth. So the myth that we don't really know what populism is, that it is essentially contested. I think we're really done with that. I think we are at the stage that there is a consensus in the field, despite small differences here and there. We now find ourselves in a place that we all more or less agree on what populism is. There is a common understanding, and this is quite good. I really don't know why some people keep insisting on starting their articles about the fact that we really don't know what populism is. There are so many different meanings, but let's go on with mine. We do know what it is, and I think it's a good thing for the field and the broader discussion. So the actual myth that I would like to debunk is that populism poses all kinds of populism, regardless of their orientation, that all populism poses a threat, an essential threat to pluralism and minority rights. So this is, for me, a flawed position, indeed a myth, and something that keeps returning in media articles, in political discussions, but also in parts of the scholarly literature. Now, if we understand populism as a discourse or a very thin ideology or a style that focuses on the people, that champions the people and sovereignty and opposes the elite, now we see that this is a quite thin and flexible conception. And the people can be constructed in many different ways, as well as the elite. And the very configuration of the antagonism between the people and the elite can take all kinds of different forms. And just to repeat what my colleagues just also pointed out, I fully agree that in the end, it's ideology that really matters. And it's quite often, if not always, the host ideology that defines how the people and the elite is constructed, as well as the antagonism between the two. And we know from the relevant literature that the people can be more inclusive or more exclusive. It can be heterogeneous or homogeneous. It can be feminine or masculine. It can be all different kinds of things. And the people's opposition to the elite or the establishment can be based on different kinds of foundations. It can be based on socioeconomic factors. The elites are enforcing policies that are actively hurting the majority of the people in terms of their economic and social status. It can be based on culture and law and order. The elites are following an open borders, multicultural policy that is eroding our culture and letting dangerous immigrants in, something that we often find in the populist radical right. Or it can be based on corruption or moral concerns. The elites are fundamentally corrupt and self-serving and so on and so forth. So the different possibilities here are truly endless. And what matters is that we understand why and how things might go one or the other way in certain regions, institutional settings, historical periods, and so on and so forth. saying that populism, in all its variety and ambiguity, is a priori threatening to pluralism and minority rights, which are two essential elements of liberal democracy, is both limiting the scope of relevant research and imbues our research with certain avoidable biases, at least in my view. And we now have relevant research that has shown that populist movements, populist parties, and leaders and governments, most often on the left side of the spectrum, have actually played a key role in promoting minority rights while advancing a more inclusive and pluralist understanding of society. More recently, research has also shown that populist voters are quite pluralistic themselves in their view of the political system and of political representation and participation, or they can be like that. And this, of course, does not mean that all populists are defenders of minority rights and pluralism, right? It means, however, that we cannot simply ignore those that are. It can go both ways, and it's good that we are aware of it. Now, moving on to answering the second question, if one understands populism as primarily a form of discourse or ideology, the way that we've been discussing here today, then I don't think that we can expect a specific set of outcomes, a specific set of causes, effects on democratic politics, on democratic institutions, and so on, once populists get to power. And this is because, as everyone has pointed out before me, what really matters in policy implementation, what really matters in terms of attitudes towards institutions and so on, is the host ideology. And as Daphne very rightly said earlier, what we're witnessing today as a kind of erosion of democracy that is often attributed to populists, it actually has all to do with authoritarianism and not populism itself. So to give an example, a very easy and simple comparison here in terms of the lasting changes that populists might leave behind when they are in office, think about the tenure of the then populist left, not so much populist anymore, Syriza party in Greece. What were some of the policies that this party left behind? I can pick some that might seem atypical when someone has a more stereotypical view of populism in mind, like the one that we see in the media. So a citizenship law that made it much easier for children of immigrants to get full citizenship rights, legislation that allowed same-sex couples to participate in civil union and to also foster children. What else? The agreement between Greece, the treaty between Greece and Northern Macedonia that ended a long nationalist, bitter dispute between the two countries. And finally, not to mention the sound economic management of the third bailout program for Greece, which of course did not make many of the voters of the party happy, because this meant implementing harsh austerity. But again, quite atypical when we think about how populists are often accused for macroeconomic mismanagement and so on. And we can compare that to policies implemented by Donald Trump or Viktor Orban, which are totally at the other side of the spectrum, especially with minority rights, pluralism, institutions, and so on in mind. Of course, none of the two really have to do anything with their populist. So this is why how we can go back to the importance, the meaning of the host ideologies, and why it is so crucial that when we talk about populism, when we evaluate populism, we actually evaluate populism and not other non-populist ideological elements. Now, finally, if I got such a huge ground, what I would do, what unexplored dimension of populism I would look at, I guess I would look at anti-populism, which is part of a broader research agenda that looks at populism as a signifier in the public sphere, how populism is used, misused, and abused in the public sphere. So why are there so many people that think populism is the most threatening, the most dangerous thing facing democracy right now? And why so many politicians actually use this as part of their identity? What does it mean to be an anti-populist politician? Does it actually mean anything? And we have some theoretical background here, which is quite normative, from Ernesto Laclau, Zach Rancière, and others, that have suggested that anti-populism, in fact, masks some kind of new fear of the masses, some kind of elitism, or in the words of Rancière, even some kind of hatred for democracy. But we need more empirical research into what it actually means. Some scholars like Aurélien Mondon have used the various uses of populism with a euphemization of the far right, the euphemization of racism, of authoritarianism, and so on. Yeah, I'm wrapping it up. But it can mean all different kinds of things. So I will leave it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Giorgos, and it's such a pleasure to have a set of brilliant minds, which also are quite on time. So now I would give a brief opportunity, which I will also give you the chance to wave, to react to each other, if you want to react to one another on the panel. And then what awaits us after is the questions from the audience, which you may start to think about. And I would then collect them by 3, and we will see how many rounds we will be able to do. So I will go in the same order. If Sarah wants to react, please, and then we will go to the audience questions.
Given that we are remarkably in agreement here, I think it's not necessary to respond to each other extensively, and we can move to the audience. I think that will be better for everyone.
So everybody agrees. So there's also everybody is extremely agreeable. Thank you so much. And there was a lot of agreement, but also some great ideas from all of you. So this gives us the opportunity to turn to you. So if you would like to ask the question, you can. I would ask you to introduce yourself. Like, you don't have to tell us your CV, but just your name and affiliation, and then indicate whether you ask to whom you want to pose the question, whether to individual panelists or to the panel as a whole. I will collect 3 in the first round, and let's see how many rounds we will be able to do. So raise your hand, the microphone will reach you, and let's take it from here.
Okay, thank you for your responses. I'm going to halfway piggyback on my neighbor here, Luca. We both were commenting that we found your interventions very interesting, but we...
Sorry, could you please, there is one rule, and the rule is, could you please introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. Okay. My name is André Zaslav from Radboud University in the Netherlands. And I feel like I agree that the host ideology is more important, but I also feel like all of you have evaded the black hole, to quote Luca, of populism. So I think that there is also something in populism itself that is a mechanism that makes a difference. And I'll give you 2 examples. So I agree that the host ideology is more important, but if we look at what unites these very different parties, it's populism. We know this from demand-side literature. We can look at voting. We can know that the voters disagree on everything except for populism. So I think this is interesting, right? So it's mobilizing voters for a specific reason, right? And I would say, responding to the question of trust, right? It's an answer to something, right? You can be low trusting and you could vote for a fascist party, right? But if you're voting for a populist party, it's voting for a certain idea of political representation. So there's something going on, I think, in a broader sense. And then I'll give one other example. I think at the party level, populism itself it's important for how the populist party engages with the institutions. So I would make a claim, which maybe some would disagree. I would say that Salvini was a populist, and I would make the claim that Meloni now is not a populist. And I think this is very important with how Meloni and Salvini interact with the institutions in Italy, right? And I think so. Here, I'm just trying to think of examples of the mechanism. And then I say one thing, and then I stop. I think as well, if we look at populism in this way, we can also say that populism is it can be more or less. It can change, right? So I was wondering, the panel on the future of populism, can we say now that maybe if populism has been around for a while, that maybe it's diminishing, and what does this mean? Or in some cases, it might be diminishing, and what does this mean for the future of populism? I'll stop there.
Thank you. And we have the next question, gentleman in the third row in a pink shirt.
Thank you. I'm Johannes from the Joaquim Nabuco Foundation in Brazil. I think what we hear and read about populism, there's an issue which I'll put in a rather naive way, but with a methodological and theoretical implication to it. We can agree that populism is about a lot of things. It has a contextual quality, it has historical diversity, there's ideological plurality about it, there's institutional performances, different ones, and so on. Then there's the thorny issue when we move from populism to populist, to really name, identify, and pinpoint something as kind of fitting that particular definition of populism. And when this is needed, there are criteria that needs to be applied. There are theoretical assumptions that we need to use. My question to you at this point in time of your work is, when you need to move from this broad, rich definition of populism to really study particular movements, parties, people, and name them as populist, what does drive you? I mean, how can we really what kind of steps methodologically and theoretically do we take to do this kind of concrete, so to speak, application of the definition or the theory? Thank you.
Thank you so much. My name is Juan Roch from Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. Yes, my comment and question, I was really positively surprised about the self-critical account of all intervenants here. But at the same time, why I don't know if to be happy or to throw away all my research on populism, because it's really the least, you know, it's quite, I would like to ask if, to what extent it is the least important feature of those parties and the methodological implications of that, because it's huge methodological implications. I mean, all this research saying that populism, it has an impact on democratic institutions. We should totally give up this kind of research, or we can trace back causally and distinguish between host ideology and populism. To what extent it has methodological implications would be great to hear about that. And the second question is about an additional problem that I think when we want to analyze populism and the impact on democracy, that is how populism is changing across time as well. Even to the same political party that we have found evidence on that recently. If the same political party is changing the degree of populism, to what extent this is also problematic to infer causality in terms of democratic institutions. Thank you.
Yes, yeah. Thank you for to the first three questions. I will reverse the order to kind of have more. So, and I will give you the opportunity to pick which question you want to answer, how you want to react. And I will start, if it's okay with you, Giorgos.
Let's start from the second question. So how do we essentially operationalize populism in empirical research? So there are different paths, different ways. So I work from the tradition that is based on Ernesto Laclau and the Essex School of Discourse Analysis. So the particular understanding of populism in that tradition is that populism is an antagonistic discourse that has the people as a nodal point, a central reference. Everything revolves around this reference of the people that can take different names, the underdog, the many, and so on and so forth. This subject is constructed in an equivalential way, which is what Laclau suggests. In simple words, it means that out of a heterogeneity, a plurality of different social groups and subjects, populists create some kind of unity, posing the people against an enemy, against the elite, against the establishment. So this kind of negative identification works as the kind of glue that brings the people together, but does not reduce them in one thing. So more or less, I'm trying to simplify here what is often seen as a rather complex theoretical apparatus. So what we do is we focus on discourse in its broader sense, not just text, speeches, and so on, but also images, what kind of meaning they create, symbolisms, and so on and so forth. And in the end of the day, we're looking at those co-references to the nodal point of the people, the way that the people is constructed, the way that the elite is constructed, and how the antagonism between the two is signified. And I think this kind of methodology links back to a series of questions that we've been trying to answer here today, or problems that we've been trying to solve. This is one way to approach the matter. So do I just pick one? Yeah, okay, I'm good. I would be happy to answer more, but.
Yeah, I think that would allow us then to do more rounds. So Kai now, and then Daphne and Sarah.
Okay, so I think your question was very interesting, or it was more of a comment perhaps on the impact of democracy and understandings of democracy that populists might have. And I cannot add much to that observation, but I think it provides a very interesting link to this emerging literature that tries to empirically find out what citizens expect from democracy, what the important elements of democracy might be, and that might give an answer in the short and medium term to your question, whether we see change in these indicators under populist government, if you wish. I'm not sure. You still look quite confused, and I feel quite confused. So perhaps I completely misunderstood your angle.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to answer, I think all three questions were actually very related. So I'm going to address all three in one, but starting or kind of focusing on what Andre said. And we've talked about it a lot, haven't we? So you know where I stand on this. But overall, I'd say I agree with you that populism is also important. And the way it is important, you know that I sort of depart in my definition. I like to focus on Riker's definition of populism, who basically claims that populism is sort of not only the legitimate, but the only moral way to make decisions in society. So essentially what populism does is it elevates the popular will, the so-called popular will. But of course, that's really authoritarian because there is no such thing, because always somebody will be excluded from the decision-making process. There is no such thing as the will of the people. It's only some people. So the will of the people is the will of some people becoming the ultimate way to make decisions in society. For this reason, I'll be controversial here, and I will disagree with you that whereas I do think it's the host ideology, I think that any populism is dangerous for democracy because the very essence of populism is basically to exclude people who do not have the same position. So I think it's dangerous whichever way we go about it. Having said that, however, I also think, because you said, should I throw away my research on populism? Certainly not. Do not throw away your research on populism. But at the same time, I think the problem when we only focus on populism is that we kind of lose track of what it is that we're trying to explain. In essence, we're a political scientist, or at least I see myself as a political scientist who wants to explain a phenomenon. But it seems that the study has moved on from explaining a phenomenon to actually disentangling populism as a term. Sometimes we're talking about populism, sometimes we maybe not be talking about populism. So I think if we focus simply on the theoretical dimension of disentangling populism, we kind of lose we lose track of the ultimate dependent variable, right? Which could be authoritarianism, which could be the far right, which could be democratic backsliding, which could be effective polarization. So I think we need to decide whether we're here to disentangle populism or whether we're also here to explain a pertinent societal phenomenon and its many dimensions.
Also in response to Andre, of course, populism is important. And there was a very good article on the Loop blog a couple of months ago. I think it was by Stein van Kessel, where he shows that populism is not just compatible with any host ideology. So in the far-right context, obviously, this idea of having a homogeneous people and of excluding the others really resonates with the nativism of the far-right. So perhaps an answer to your point is, on the one hand, it is important, but on the other hand, it's sort of secondary. It helps to create resonance for the host ideology.
So thank you for these questions, because I think that they're very much related. So like Daphne, I'm going to try to pick them up all at the same time. One of the advances I think we've made as a field is that we do not only agree on what populism is in conceptual terms, but that there's also broad acknowledgement that parties, movements, leaders can be more or less populist, right? That it's a matter of degree at times, and that we can measure that empirically in all kinds of different types of communication, whether that's electoral manifestos, parliamentary speeches, public communications at rallies. And I think that creates a lot of variation that we can work with to establish issues of causality, right? So it's not necessarily the case that all parties that we're interested in this respect are populist in both their electoral communication and their parliamentary communications, for example. Andre himself pointed me to the Dutch PVV yesterday, which, especially in how it behaves in parliament, has become far more mainstream than how it operates in the electoral arena. And I think we can exploit these kinds of variations to answer some of these questions about causality, the same way we can exploit the fact that some parties cease to be populist at certain points in time for strategic reasons or other reasons, and that there's a lot of variation at the local level that we can also exploit. And I think in response also to Andre's question, I completely agree about the mechanisms, right? The populism is relevant for certain types of understanding, certain types of behavior. But it's very difficult to disentangle when that is the case, to pick it apart. And one of the things that I think we continuously need to do is also compare what we think are populist parties with non-populist parties to make sure that we do not assume that it is the populism doing something, instead of some general trends in politics. I mean, you talk about how populist parties operate in parliament. Uncivility has been cited as one of their sort of strategies that they might employ to disrupt parliamentary proceedings. But it could equally be the case that because of other kinds of developments in politics and society, all political parties are becoming more uncivil. So I think exploiting variation and comparing with non-populist parties all the time is the key to getting to the essence of these kinds of mechanism questions.
Thank you. And last.
So I want to say something about the Fratelli d'Italia and Brothers of Italy as a populist party or not. I think that, well, we can agree that it's a radical right party, right? So it's kind of nativism and authoritarianism are prevalent, and we can agree with that. I think that now I'm also studying that. I mean, I'm conducting a real research on that to see how Brothers of Italy is adapting to government, in terms of using populism and other kind of, rhetorical tools. And I think that maybe it's just a fictional effect because Brothers of Italy is still a populist party. Maybe we are just taking, you are seeing a fictional effect of a party that has huge problems in terms of credibility because of its past, and is trying to reduce as much as possible room for possible controversies, especially in view of the new European elections. So maybe it's just about a change in the strategy, but in terms of ideology, we have, various papers that stress the fact that Brothers of Italy is a populist party in ideological terms, but maybe now we are seeing a different effect in terms of strategy, but we need to do more research. After the transition to government. So it's an empirical question, I think. So in my view, they are both populist for the time being. So thank you.
Thank you. So this would conclude the first round. I would now give the opportunity also to our online questions. So I will read them out, but I believe you can also see them in front of yourself. But I will read them. Maybe you can see them. I just try to read it briefly. So Jan Filip Tomeček asks, I would like to pick on the thoughts of Giorgos, who highlighted that populism is not only the populist radical right, but also the populist radical left. The last big financial crisis, okay, well, I have to read it all. The last big financial crisis 15 years ago led to an electoral success of populist radical left, including many new parties such as Syriza and Podemos, who were also governing at some point in Europe. Currently, we are experiencing record high inflation rates, but the populist radical left seems not to gain anything from that. What do you all, okay, it was Giorgos, okay, then it's to everybody, think, is this likely to change? The opportunity structure seems ideal for a left-wing populist framing of the current situation. So that's one question towards the future. The second, to test the claim that there is scholarly consensus about the meaning of populism, can the panel agree to a general definition of populism that would not accidentally equate it with democracy, socialism, or ethno-nationalism? Okay, I thought like 2 decades of this, but okay, it always comes back. So let's try to do that quickly. Whoever wants to take that one. And the final online question, which we will have the time for, is by Jules Bradshaw from Liverpool, John Moores University. How does the panel reconcile populist leaders claiming to represent the everyman against the elite when those leaders such as Donald Trump of the US or Rishi Sunak in the UK come from the high of the elite group, money, education, opportunity? So thank you for your online question. I'll give the panel the opportunity to answer quickly. And let's start with Sarah.
I'm fine, I think. Yeah, to start with the last question, I love this question because it's one that's been intriguing me for 2 decades now. Because it doesn't only go for these really well-known populist politicians. It goes for Pim Fortuyn in the Netherlands, who had a butler and drove a limousine. It goes for Jörg Haider. It even goes for Jean-Marie Le Pen, who is a millionaire. So these politicians are not representative of the people in descriptive terms, but I think they are in discursive and symbolic terms in the way that they present themselves, their way of life, which articulates common practices of the people. I mean, Donald Trump, he eats hamburgers and drinks Coca-Cola. Right, that's also part of his image. It's these common practices that everyday citizens engage in, and I think a lot of these kinds of politicians put these kind of practices to the fore. And there's also an additional element, which is, I think, sort of the leaders that sort of game the system in a way. I mean, I always think of Berlusconi as the first person who really had this image already early in the 90s. And a lot of Italians felt attracted to him because in a way, he gamed the establishment. And therefore, he also gets credit in this populist opposition between ordinary citizens and elite, and I think the same goes for Donald Trump in a way. So I'll leave it at that, even though I also have thoughts on the first question.
Okay, thank you, Daphne.
Thank you. Let me start then with the first question, which is indeed, what about the radical left? I think that's actually, if you look at electoral trajectories in the past, 10, 15 years, that's precisely the puzzle. How come we have had a series of societal crises? We had a massive economic crisis in Europe, and yet really the radical left parties that did well, they're a handful only. And actually it is the radical right that has benefited. So here I would say two things. I think, do I think the question, I can't see it now, but the question was, do you think the inflation will change this? Well, I don't tell the future, but looking at the past trajectories, probably not, right? Because they did not gain so much. It is the radical right that gained. And I think the reason why the radical right gains is exactly what I said earlier when I discussed the different voters. So really what the radical right has done, and if you look at, for example, the position of radical right parties on economic issues, they've become so much more welfarist. They actually focus much more on economy, welfare issues, etc. So they're actually using a nationalist / welfarist narrative to try and get precisely those disaffected voters who are not voting for the left. And I think in a broader context, we can also see, what the PASOKification, I think is called, right, of politics in Europe. In fact, it's a broader crisis of for the left. The left is not only the radical, the left, and I think that's partly because they have their own identity crisis, right? The left is somewhere discussing, should we be populist? Should we be anti-immigrant? Where should we stand? And at the same time, it is the radical right that knows exactly what kind of strategy is more likely to attract disaffected people of various positions on the left-right spectrum.
Thank you. Could we go to Kai?
Yeah, on the last question, Trump eating hamburgers, that's an excellent point. I think it just shows the power of populism that can plaster over economic differences and highlight cultural similarities. So people vote for Trump knowing full well that he's probably a billionaire, perhaps a few billion less than he declared in his commercial interest. But anyway, he's still one of us. And I think that works so well also in the American context because people believe in vertical mobility. They believe that they could be rich too if they only work hard enough, if they only apply themselves, and so on and so forth. So in my view, especially in the Trumpian case, there is no contradiction at all. Regarding the first point, I would latch on Sarah's explanation. Is it really about the populism, or was it the left-wing radicalism that drove the success of Syriza and Podemos in Spain? So perhaps they were successful because the economic situation was dire, they offered a radical alternative, and they also happened to be populist, but perhaps that was only a secondary thing. And regarding the last part of the first question, is this the perfect opportunity structure for left-wing populists? I'm not so sure, because even if we go back 15 years in time, there was the external other that could be blamed. It was American capitalism, American banks. Now, where does the high inflation come from? It's not so easy to identify the other that can be blamed for the economic difficulties that we're encountering at the moment.
Could I briefly follow up on the first question? Because I completely agree with Daphne that we need to understand this as a broader crisis of the left. And there's something really interesting going on there, that if we look at surveys, that at the individual level, citizens find socioeconomic issues very important at election time, especially now with inflation, etc. But if you then look at sort of what the aggregate societal conflict is, both, on the side of political parties, but also in how it plays out in the perceptions of citizens of what kind of groups are standing opposite each other, then the social cultural conflict is very dominant. And I think part of that discrepancy also has to do with the media, which we haven't discussed a lot, and the kinds of issues they discuss and how they frame particular issues, either as socioeconomic or social cultural. And I think that is part, at least, of the story as to why current elections are not more about socioeconomic conflict and why the left is not profiting from the opportunity that the current economic conditions are offering for them.
And Giorgos has a microphone. Excellent.
Okay, thank you. So before I answer the questions, I would like to get the opportunity to briefly react to what Daphne said about the populism and democracy, and we're having a conversation, this roundtable. So I'm not really convinced that claiming to represent the will of the people necessarily leads to authoritarianism, for the quite simple reason that everyone is doing it. Every political party, populist, non-populist, whatever, they all speak in the name of the people. In the night of an election, everyone suggests that the people have spoken, the people have elected me, and now I'm going to do politics for the people. And there are different ways to represent the people and their will. Some populists suggest that I and I alone, how did Trump say it, represent the people, and radically excluded others, especially migrants, people he didn't like, and so on and so forth. But there are also populists that suggest that we represent the working people, the producers, and so on and so forth, but they do not suggest that they will deprive others of their political rights or whatever. This is the stuff of politics. This is how politics is done. And there are different ways to represent the people and their will. And as I understand it, this then depends on whether populism turns into authoritarianism or not. This is an open discussion. So can we understand this kind of slippery slope towards authoritarianism the same way if we look at Bernie Sanders and AOC in the US on the one hand and Donald Trump on the other? Do the two kinds of populists lead to the same authoritarian path? I'm really not convinced. So moving forward, of course, this is a much bigger discussion. I'm oversimplifying. Moving on to some of the other great questions. So the populist left is not gaining what changed. I agree with everything that has been said about it. And just to briefly build on what Sarah was just saying, the concept of mainstreaming. So all those years after the crisis, both in the media and in mainstream political actors, the kind of ideas, the narratives that have been mainstreamed and legitimized are much more those of the radical right and not of the radical left. And this created, according to relevant research, and with I happen to agree, more space for the radical right to flourish. And we've seen this in many countries where the center-right has co-opted the agenda of the far right. Quite often they did good themselves, but the far right did even better, which I think one case in point is Greece nowadays. As Daphne mentioned earlier, we now have 3 radical right parties in parliament, and part of the old populist radical right is actually now ministers in today's government, the Popular Orthodox Rally, for those that know Greek politics. And if we have time for more questions, I don't want to keep going, so I can leave it here.
Excellent. I know, but I have seen Daphne wants to respond, so I think that's great. So please, Daphne, and then I will calculate how many time we have.
Thank you. I'll just be a split second to respond to this, right? But so I think the problem is, if you're wrong, then populism is authoritarian for the reasons that we discussed, right? Because they exclude those who don't adhere to the will of the people. If you're right, then populism is nothing more than a tautology. Because if everybody is using populist narratives, and if we define populism as everybody who says we represent the will of the people is a populist, then populism is reduced to a tautological, meaningless concept that helps us not at all in understanding the phenomena we're trying to explain. So it's a catch-22, and I don't know what's...
Second answer to this. 10 seconds, I promise.
Oh.
No, this is just one element of understanding populism. So not everyone that speaks in the name of the people and the will of and defends the will of the people is a populist. They have to present other characteristics as well. They have to be antagonistic to the elite, and this antagonism can take different forms. It can be a classic Smithian antagonism, eradicate the other. It can be agonism, like Move has suggested. Fight the other, but respect their legitimacy. So if you get both the centrality of the people and the popular will and the antagonism within it, then you get populist. So not everyone that speaks in the name of the people is a populist, but not everyone that speaks in the name of the people in the end ends up being authoritarian as well, if that makes sense.
So I have a proposal. We have 7 minutes, and I am going to do the next round, but I would like to define a question. I'm not going to give you a definition of populism, but I'm going to give you a definition of question. It's a very brief question, and it ends with a question mark, and it's structured as a question. So we, unfortunately, with other words, we don't have time for comment, but we have time for 2 brief questions and hopefully for some amazing brief answers. I see many hands, but the microphone already reached the lucky winner. Brief question, sir, please.
Okay, thank you. I'm Allan Dreyer Hansen from Denmark, from the University of Roskilde. And I think that the very strong dividing line in this debate, which you elegantly jumped over, Giorgos, in your introduction, is the question of moralism. That those who define populism as an ideology need to have something to put up. Sorry. So my question to the panel is, how do we define moralism, and how do we distinguish it from what most people would think of as democratic, legitimate, anti-opposition or something like that?
And one more. Okay, the microphone has a life of its own.
All right, thank you. So quick question. Claudia Koja, University of Salzburg, PhD candidate. My question is regarding populism scales. If you would have to choose between the worst scale so far and the better one. I know it's a difficult question because, you know, it's not nice to be so direct about your colleagues' work, but I often wondered that it's in many ways the scales that kind of feed into this populism research that is not always useful. So if you could give me an answer on that, I would really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I mean, that's a good question for the end of a lot of friendships. So, okay, I agree with Daphne. We have a discipline by the people asking questions, we will have I promised, you know, it's like with populists, like they promise you the sky and they keep promising me quick answer. More, there's one in the very enthusiastic in the back. And the shorter he will be, the more chance he will give to the last person.
Very fast. I'm Mattia from University of Naples, and thank you for this discussion, really interesting. I believe that it's interesting to think about the effects that the government have on populists, about their organization, their communication, how they change. I think it's, you know, Meloni's case and so on. And so, the variables of populism are the same changes or not?
No, we will stay here. It's 11. You each have 45 seconds, starting with Sarah. Pick what you want. We cannot satisfy everybody.
Yeah, I'm going to pick the bravest question because I think you have guts if you ask that as a PhD student. Thank you for putting us on the spot. And I'm probably going to not make some friends here. I am currently not convinced that by measuring the degree of populism through expert surveys, we're picking up more than just echoes of common sense. So given that we have a general agreement that we think that populism can vary quite a bit over time in different contexts, different arenas, personally, I think that the way forward is really through, you know, good, solid content analysis that really picks up on the different dimensions of populism and pays a particular attention to their co-occurrence at the same time.
Daphne?
Sure. I'll respond to this as a broader question about how to measure populism. And I think measuring populism is very, very difficult regarding which scale that we look at. Now, I think in terms of the supply, so we have two dimensions, right? Look at the parties, the supply. Do they use populism? How populist are they? And there I also, I guess, agree with Sarah that degrees are complicated, and perhaps having a more dichotomous measure is a clearer way. But then I want to also focus on the demand and say that actually I think that the real problem that we are having is when we're trying to measure demand side. So the populist voter, the populist citizen. And there I think the problem, speaking broadly, I don't want to highlight one or two measures, but just speaking broadly, the problem that we need to overcome is that many of the measures that we're looking at actually may be capturing something else. So we could be capturing anti-establishment. We could be capturing anti-elitism. We could be capturing authoritarian attitudes. So what we really need to do, to make me frame it positively rather than negatively, is to help develop, think about these things through and help develop scales that actually measure populism rather than any other category that is subsumed within it.
Thank you. Kai?
Yeah, on the last question, effects of government on populists. I think that's a fantastic question. And my hunch is it very much depends on the type of populist. So if you look at Johnson and Trump, you could think, well, they were not up to it. They were simply not very good politicians. So their government was chaotic, stumbling, and so on and so forth. End of the problem solved in a sense. But I think that's not necessarily true. I think this is just because they were not very good at governing. And there are other examples. Think of Orban. I think what can happen in these cases is that they use the machinery of government for their populist policies. And that is, I think, contrary to what Sarah said, this is probably more dangerous than having them in opposition once they get access to the government machine.
Thank you, Giorgos.
To answer the question about moralism, so I didn't really speak about moralism because I don't think that it is such a fundamental defining element of populism, which is one disagreement between the Lachlorians and the ideational scholars. And thankfully, there is some research on it. I think we need more empirical research on modes of moralist discourse, moralist framing of ideas, and so on. And just wanted to mention one paper that I found very, very interesting out a few days ago, Marina Wachter and Marie-Lise Jacobson, and they study the discourse of Sweden Democrats and try to figure out whether they're more moralist than other parties and how they are. The finding is that they're actually not top moralizers, but they use moral values and moral predispositions in different ways, which I find very interesting. And then I think that the chapter of Pierre Ostigui in the Oxford Handbook of Populism also makes some very interesting points about moralism and populism in Latin America. So I will leave it there, and thank you for the excellent questions.
Thank you. Last one sentence to Mattia.
On the effects of government participation, it depends on various factors, like whether you govern alone or in coalition, who are your coalition partners. That depends on the organizational development, for instance, of the party, and also on other external factors, whatever they mean.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I won't be summarizing. We are slightly over time. Perhaps I think if you should take away one thing from the panel, or maybe take two, it's the host ideology is stupid. I think this is the agreement of the whole panel. Let's focus on the host ideology and disentangle this. And the final word before thanking our panelists is please read the Loop Future of Populism series. Don't hesitate to pitch Mattia and myself. We believe that these could be also study materials for your students. So come to us with that. And finally, please thank with me Sarah de Lange, Daphne Halikiopoulou, Kai Arzheimer, Giorgos Katsambekis.